This week, we're looking at the period of American imperialism. Now, the United States had been growing up. We had fought our Civil War, and by doing so, we had greatly strengthened our military power. We had been growing in industrial power throughout the Industrial Revolution. And now, as we saw in a previous unit, the United States was, at the end of the 19th century, almost to the end of pushing across the North American continent and securing the land and civilizing it. So we were ready to start looking outward into the world to become a great world power like Spain had been, like Britain and France were. And so as the United States is ready to start becoming an imperial power, we're first of all going to have to find territories which we can secure overseas. And there are benefits to having these territories. First of all, by securing territories overseas, the United States would have bases for our Navy and places that our trade ships could stop and refuel. At this point, we're in the age of coal, steam-powered ships, and so we're going to need bases. And that would allow us to protect our trade around the world and extend our trade into other areas. By securing territories, we would have access to those raw materials that these places might have. We would also have, with the citizens there, a possible workforce or even a market for our goods. Now, there's also another side to expanding American imperialism. Besides just the economic and trade benefits that we might gain, there's the prestige that we would gain by becoming a great military power around the world. There was also a humanitarian side to it. Many Americans believed that with our modern society, we had a responsibility to go out and use our science to cure disease, to help develop other countries, and to bring other civilizations up to our level of civilization, whether or not they actually wanted to be brought up to it. We felt like it was our responsibility. And at this time, there was a flowering of Protestant Christianity in America, where these Protestant churches were now rich enough, powerful enough to start extending their influence by doing mission work around the world. And so you see a number of things that have Americans looking outward. And so the problem is, America is a latecomer to the game. The old European powers have already grabbed almost all the great territories around the world. So that left us and a few of the other newcomers to the imperialism game searching for what was left. And the other newcomers are Germany, which had just become a nation, and Italy, which had just become a nation. Both had recently been unified and were now looking to become great powers globally. And you also had Japan, who had been brought into the modern world, partially thanks to us, and they were trying to become a great industrial power on the European model. And so we've got some competition for the scraps that are left over. Now, the first little piece of empire that the United States gains, and you may not know it, but we own Samoa, at least part of it. The Samoan Islands, as you can see on a map, they are not right in the center of the Pacific Ocean as a great stopping point on the way to Asia, but they were the best thing available at that moment. And the United States and Germany both had our eyes on these islands. And so both of us go down there and start to try to secure bases and start to try to secure control of these islands. Both of us send warships to the islands, and we intend to take control. And actually, there was a little bit of hope, both by the United States and by Germany, at least our militaries, that we would fight for the islands, because this would be another chance for us to flex our military muscle and show people we are a grown-up power now. And so I think it was kind of acceptable to both of these militaries, both these navies, to have a war for these islands. And so we both have warships there, and we're watching each other closely. But before we can have a grand and glorious war to seize control of the islands, Mother Nature was victorious. And as you can see in these pictures here, the United States and German fleets were destroyed by a cyclone, by a hurricane that came through. So we were stuck with just settling this by a treaty, and the United States and Germany split the Samoan Islands in half, and to this day, America still owns our portion of the Samoan Islands. Now, the next territory that we gain control of is much better location for our trade ships going across and trading in Asia, and that was Hawaii. Now, Hawaii had been explored, and there was already trade going through there. Britain had connections with Hawaii. The United States began making connections with Hawaii. And by the late 19th century, the United States had really gained a strong foothold in Hawaii. American businessmen had bought up most of the really good land there, and sugar and pineapple plantations were very profitable. And at this point, the Hawaiian people were starting to lose control of their islands. The real wealth of the islands was owned by foreigners, and Hawaiians worked those plantations for practically nothing, making foreign investors rich. When Queen Liliuokalani comes to the throne, she had been educated in Europe. She really understood the situation, and she understood that her people were not profiting from the riches of their islands, and she wanted to do what she could to pull back from the foreign control that had seeped into her island. She wanted to find ways to maybe regain some of this land, maybe regain some of the profits. But as we've talked about with American capitalism, businessmen don't like to have their profits cut into. And when Queen Liliuokalani starts looking for ways to limit the power of these businessmen, they and the American ambassador in Hawaii, a fellow by the name of Stevens, they got together and they decided that the Hawaiian people were being oppressed by an evil queen and thus needed to declare their independence and free themselves. Now, of course, when you read about this in American newspapers, those that portray it in this manner at first make it sound like this is a great story. The Hawaiian people have been oppressed by an unfair monarchy, and just like us, they're fighting for liberty. And this is something Americans, when we first read about it, are really excited about. We're thinking this is a great thing. Hawaiian people are gaining freedom. So what happens is the American ambassador and the American planners get together. They find a little group of Hawaiians that they can manipulate and are loyal to them, and they declare independence. As soon as they declare independence, the planters then go to Stevens and they say, we're American citizens, we own property, and the United States must protect our lives and our property because there's a war in Hawaii, which there was not. But there's a war, there's a revolution, and we're in danger. Please call up the U.S. Marines. And there was a naval ship there with Marines in the harbor. So Stevens, on behalf of Americans who were at risk, calls up the Marines. The Marines then march in and force the Queen to abdicate. And then they form a new government, which was mostly controlled by the Americans. And this new government then asks to be annexed by the United States. Now, we think at first this is a great story. And America is getting ready to annex Hawaii. But when President Cleveland found out what really happened, he decided this is not right, this is not the way we do things, and he refused to allow annexation to go through. However, just because he said you must give the island back to the Queen does not mean that the new government did so. Instead, they waited around a few years until the United States had kind of forgotten the initial uproar over what had really happened. And as the Spanish-American War was approaching, and the United States was looking to gain more territories, plus we were concerned somebody else might get it before we did. Finally, President McKinley is able to get Hawaii annexed to the United States. Not surprisingly, there are some Hawaiians who do not feel like they got a fair deal and that Hawaii was stolen from them. Hopefully, being a state of the United States has been good for Hawaii, and hopefully a lot of Hawaiians are happy to be Americans. But at the same time, you can understand why there would be some who feel like this was not America living up to our ideals. In fact, imperialism. America gaining territories by force doesn't sound like our ideals, and in fact, it is not. Just because we're strong enough to seize territory does not mean we should. We believe that people should have self-government, and we're not giving self-government to these people. But of course, we had gone through more than a century of securing land from the natives and not treating them by our ideals. And now we were stretching out into the world. But some Americans were calling us on it. Some Americans, as we'll see in the progressive era, are going to be speaking out against the problems we have in America. And some will actually be writing and protesting and actually saying that the United States should not be in the business of taking territories. So there is a public outcry against what's going on. Nevertheless, the United States is starting to become an outright imperial power by gaining a few territories. But we're also starting to flex our muscle in the world. We're starting to become a global presence. Now, back in 1820, if you remember in History 1301, you learned about something called the Monroe Doctrine, where a very young United States had declared that all of these new republics freeing themselves from Spain in Central and South America were to be protected, that Europe was not allowed to come in and try to reconquer these countries, and if they did, the United States would stop them, which was a joke. We were a brand new little country with hardly any navy. We couldn't stop any of those European powers from doing it, but Britain could. Britain had our back on this. They had actually suggested we do something jointly, and then we got out there and did it on our own. But Britain's navy and influence was able to help prevent Spain or France or some of those other countries from coming over and trying to seize these territories. But now the United States was grown up. Now the United States was actually powerful enough and had built up a strong enough navy that we could enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And ironically, the very first country we enforce it on is the very country that used to have our back on this issue, Great Britain. In 1895, Britain had control of a territory called British Guiana on the northern coast of South America, right next to Venezuela. And there was a border dispute over where the territories began and ended. And so in this border dispute, Britain was getting ready to use force to secure the territory they claimed was theirs. And for the first time ever, the United States steps in and enforces the Monroe Doctrine. We say, no, you don't, Britain. We will listen to the case. You make your case. Venezuela, you make your case. And we, the United States, will decide where that border goes. Now, Germany was becoming a major power in Europe, and Britain was really more concerned with the growing German threat, and they didn't want trouble with a country that had really grown to be a friendly nation to them and an ally, the United States. So Britain allowed us to arbitrate, and we decided the issue. Now, this sounds like a good thing, and in many ways it was. We were saving Venezuela from getting their teeth kicked in by the British. However, we didn't exactly do it in a way that built us friendship down there. We go in and we tell Venezuela, all right, Venezuela, we're going to save you. Now, shut up, stand back, and we'll settle this. And so this becomes our way of doing things. We look at the South American and Central American nations kind of like our little brothers, and we're going to protect them. And we think we're doing a great thing by doing that, but we don't always treat them with the level of respect that we would another country, that we ought to treat another country. We don't always ask their input. And what's even worse, as this pattern of American intervention continues, because we're not going to let Europeans come in and decide where the border is or collect a debt that is owed to them, it ends up being the United States that goes down there and makes these decisions and draws these lines and sometimes even sends boots on the ground and collects these debts. We're starting to become the interventionists down there. We're doing it, in our minds, for the right reasons, to protect our neighbors. And some of those countries are going to be grateful, but others of them, they're going to become bitter at the United States for the manner in which we're doing this, and also for the opportunism that we see economically to sometimes go down there and invest in their countries. And we, again, will think of that as trying to develop them and bring them civilization, but we're making a profit off of it too. And sometimes they see, like Hawaii had, that American investments coming in don't always profit the regular folks in a country. So we feel like we're wearing the white hat, we're the good guys riding to the rescue, but we don't always come across that way. And that's going to continue to be, to this very day, the issue that the United States has in dealing with our South American, Central American neighbors, is that we have a kind of mixed relationship with them over the years. Sometimes we're helpful, sometimes we're causing problems, or we're kind of just ignoring their feelings. And we still deal with this today as a nation in our foreign diplomacy with these countries. But the big event of this phase of imperialism comes in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Down in Cuba, the Cuban people were fighting for their independence from Spain, and the war was getting awfully nasty. Spain had lost its territories on the American continents. Spain was a declining empire, and they only had a few scattered islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, and they were desperately trying to hold on to these territories, but the people of Cuba were fighting for their freedom. And Americans, we read about it, we heard about it, and many of us rooted for them because of American values. They were fighting for freedom, and we're for that. At the same time, American businessmen took a look at it and said, boy, if Spain lost control of those islands, we could really invest down there, and that would be good for us. And so they were interested in it. And on a lot of levels, America's rooting for the Cubans. Now, one of the terms you have is yellow journalism. Newspapers promoted by American businessmen who were very interested in what was going on. They wanted to get the American public stirred up and pushing our government to try to get involved. And so they wrote articles meant to sway us to actually get involved in Cuba. And of course, those articles were very pro-rebels and very anti-Spanish. And so they would write awful stories about the Spanish atrocities, and they would leave out any atrocities the rebels happened to commit. In one horrible case, a village, according to the newspaper article, a village that had been supporting the rebels, the Spanish had marched in there and slaughtered the men. It turns out that was exactly the opposite. The village had been a village loyal to Spain, and the rebels had marched in and punished the villagers and slaughtered the men there. But the newspapers couldn't use that, so they just simply took the same story and flipped who did what and put it in the newspaper to make us mad at Spain. So yellow journalism's fake news. It is, or at least very biased news that is meant to sway your opinion. And that was what was used then, and you see its descendant in our modern media today sometimes. But the United States, our government's starting to feel the pressure and the interest in getting involved. And so we kind of send a message to the Spanish. Our nice modern warship that you see here, the USS Maine, was sent to Cuba to flex our muscle. We stop by, we're visiting, and of course Cuba welcomes us because they don't want trouble. And our warship stops in Havana. And then a day later, boom, it looks like this. The USS Maine exploded, killing over 200 American sailors. Now, when Americans heard that happen, they knew what happened. It's those evil Spaniards. They're evil. We've been reading about it in the papers, and now look what they've done to our ship. And we cried for war. But if you really think about it, that doesn't make any sense. Spain is not doing well in this war against rebels. Do they really want to pick a fight with us and get us involved? Makes no sense for them to do it. Truth of the matter was, 10 years after the war was over with, finally, the United States Navy was able to do an investigation, and they discovered it was a design flaw in these nice new metal warships that we had put the coal bunker right next to the ammunition with a metal wall between. And when a fire broke out in the coal bunker, the ammunition exploded. But we didn't know that until 10 years after the war. As far as we knew, the Spaniards did it. Americans cry, remember the Maine, and we demand war with Spain. And so the United States begins preparing for this splendid little war. Now, we call it the splendid little war because it's short, casualties are very light, and we gain a good bit from this war and a good bit of prestige. And it made Americans feel good. This was our first war that we fought with a foreign power since the Civil War. And for the first time, Yankees and former rebels are able to join forces and fight as Americans side by side. There were even a few former Confederate officers that actually were still able to come out of retirement and take part fighting for the United States here. So it's actually kind of a unifying event. However, remember, we call it the Splendid Little War, but no matter how small a battle or a war is, for whoever dies, they give that ultimate sacrifice. For whichever family loses their loved ones, it's as bad as if it was World War II. They lost everything. So there's no such thing as a small war, an easy war, when you take it on the personal level. So just keep that in mind. Nevertheless, on the big picture side of things, as a country, we felt like it was a great little event. And so Americans are beginning to sign up. And one of the fellows who goes out to sign up is a fellow by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was the Undersecretary of the Navy. He had helped build up this big, powerful fleet that's going to help win this war. But when the shooting started, it wasn't enough for Roosevelt to sit behind a desk because no one was shooting at him. He had to be out there with bullets whizzing by him. So he resigns his position. He gets a commission in the United States Army, and he goes out and he recruits a unit of Rough Riders. These are college athletes and cowboys and Indians and tough guys. This is who he wants to lead into battle. And so he's just among many people who are signing up and ready to go to war in Cuba. Well, as this war begins, the first battle is not in Cuba at all. While we're still preparing our forces, the United States Navy, which had missed out on our really cool war with Germany, well, now they got a chance to go to war. So they dug out the maps when they heard we were at war with Spain, and they found the Philippines. And so the U.S. fleet in the Pacific steamed towards the Philippines to pick a war with Spain. When they got there, they found the Filipinos were also fighting for their independence. And so the United States Navy in the Battle of Manila Bay, we had as modern a fleet as there was. Spain's fleet was really quite outdated. And in a battle that lasted barely an hour, we completely sunk the whole Spanish fleet there. Out of about 200 cannonballs that they fired, they had one hit one of our ships and do light damage. We crushed them. Then we landed our Marines, and we told the Filipinos we're going to help them get their independence. And the Filipinos were liberated from Spain. Unfortunately, just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, things don't work out so well here in the Philippines. Once the war is over with, we will be given the Philippines by treaty. And then we decide, you know what, you Filipinos, you're not quite ready to rule yourselves. You need us to kind of guide you along the way, which is not what they had been fighting for or they had been promised. And so they fought us to try to get us to leave them alone. And for almost a decade, we fought this nasty little war over the Philippines, which caused further outcry by those that noticed it was going on. As much as they could, the government kept this on the back pages of the newspapers as much as they were able. But eventually we forced the Filipinos to accept our rule. Only after World War II, after their troops and our troops heroically fight together to finally liberate their island from Japan, will we finally grant them their independence. But this is another little example of our period of imperialism. Now, back over in Cuba, we finally land our troops. And notice we land the troops on June 22nd, and it's all over with in 2 weeks. By July 1st, we've marched across the island. We have captured Santiago by capturing Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. And then their fleet has fled to sea, where our fleet was waiting to destroy them the same way we destroyed the fleet in the Philippines. So it's over. And like we had said we were going to, we did give the Cubans their independence, because that's what America was focused on, giving Cuba its independence. And, of course, they became independent. Immediately, the United States made political connections and business connections, and we had a very profitable relationship for about half a century, but of course, we'll see later, things will turn in the 1950s, and Cuba will become a different issue for our country. But America, at this point, we've almost reached the end of our imperialist phase. There's just one more area where we need a piece of the pie. And by the way, in that war, we had gained the Philippines, We had gained Puerto Rico and a couple other little islands across the Pacific, so we had gained more territory. But the big territory we're getting left out on is China. Everybody else had seized all the great stuff over in Asia, and we were left out. And this is the most brilliant move we do during this whole imperialist phase. Secretary of State John Hay should be remembered. This guy is smart. Everybody else has China. So he writes a letter to Great Britain. He says, you know, Britain, you're doing pretty good over there in China, but have you seen how much money the French are making down there in Hue? And he writes a letter to the Germans, and he says, hey, Germany, have you seen how much money that the English are making down there in Shanghai? And he writes a letter to the French, hey, have you seen how much money the Germans are making in Tsingtao? And so he tells everybody how much better everyone else is doing in their little spheres of influence. And he makes a suggestion. He says, look, we'd all profit much more if we made this a free trade zone, an open door policy, where everyone can trade everywhere. And they went for it. But see, the thing was, they all might have profited a little from this. We're the ones who profited the most. We had nothing, and now we have everything. It's a brilliant move, and one that didn't take a war. However, we got over there right when the Chinese had had enough of all of this. China, for years, had seen more and more of their territory forced under the control of foreign powers. And at this point, a nationalist movement called the Boxer Rebellion begins. And across China, these rebels, first of all, in the back country, are slaughtering missionaries and Chinese converts. They then move to the cities and start attacking Westerners, and even the ambassador of Germany is killed. And then they lay siege to the embassy district at Peking. And so the United States joins a multinational force which marches into China, crushes this rebellion, and ends the dynasty in China. Now China is going to enter a new phase, moving into the 20th century. So this was America's period of imperialism. But this is when the America's imperialism period ends. Much to our credit. Yes, we had gone out and used might to gain territories like we were told all the big boys are supposed to do, but there was enough outcry in America, and we did believe in our values enough that we started to think, you know, maybe as we went through the progressive movement, this is not what we should be doing. Instead, maybe these people do have a right to self-determination, and maybe the natives should have better treatment. And so by the time World War I rolls around, the United States is actually going to be putting pressure on the European countries to give up imperialism and to start to change the way they deal with their territories and even grant them self-determination and freedom. So the United States, after a very brief period of outright imperialism, starts becoming a leader in pushing for the rights of native peoples and pushing to end global imperialism. Now, of course, if you look at the United States today, some of our enemies, some of our competitors would still look at us and say we're an imperialist nation because we have a military presence around the world and because we have an economic presence around the world, and we greatly influence every single corner of the world. But it's an indirect imperialism, if it's imperialism. We don't go over to other countries and take them over to keep them. Like you've seen us intervene in Iraq, you've seen us intervene in Afghanistan. But in both of those cases, we're doing it to fight a war against terrorism, and we say we're there to try to create a democratic form of government. We did not do so well at doing that in the case of Afghanistan. But our goals are not outright imperialism, even though we certainly are influencing things around the world. So America's little period of outright imperialism is very brief. America's role in the world today is much more complex, but we are entering a new phase in world history at the turn of the 20th century.